Welcome to this JServe. We're going to be primarily talking about how you can have an impact in food security and all that sort of stuff during COVID-19. So I'm going to be introducing our two guests today that we're very lucky to have. The first is going to be Nati, who is the former executive director of the Jewish Farm School and an assistant professor in sustainable food systems at Temple University, working at the intersection of sustainable agriculture, food justice, and Jewish traditions for over 15 years. Nati also ran an award-winning garden construction program for the Urban Nutrition Initiative in Philadelphia and led service learning trips in the developing world for the American Jewish World Service. He has studied sustainable building design and natural building and is a certified permaculture designer, holding a BA in religion and environmental studies from UPenn. In his free time, you can catch him planting seeds in his garden in West Philly. And our second guest is going to be Sam Sidenfeld, who is a Brooklyn, New York-based educator and facilitator. He works with Repair the World, where he serves as the program manager, building the field of Jewish service through education and training in the topics of volunteer management, social justice, and Jewish experimental education. Outside of his work, you can find him fermenting vegetables in his apartment, volunteering at local gardens and parks, and directing his a cappella group. So now we're going to be leading into any sort of questions you have, any sort of introductions that our guests want to give, etc. So I'll throw it back to you guys.
Thanks so much, Michelle. I'm really excited to be presenting today with Nati. Nati is an amazing educator that I've had the experience of working with in a more peripheral way, and excited to work a little bit more closely on this. Just wanted to quickly share what our agenda is looking with the time that we're talking today and popping it into the chat. So we're going to open with some Jewish grounding, rooting ourselves in how this connects to our Jewish history, our Jewish experience, then moving into learning a little bit more big picture about food systems and food security, and then looking at some specific solutions and inspirations for how people are starting to mobilize and take action during this time to support those who are experiencing hunger, experiencing poverty due to the global pandemic, COVID-19. Nati, ready to kick us off?
Yeah, great. So thanks everyone. I am really grateful for the opportunity to be here with you all and share a little bit about how this moment is impacting our food system and what that means for issues of hunger and food justice over the coming weeks, months, and potentially longer. I just wanted to share my responses to this opening prompt of one thing we're grateful for and one question we have about how the pandemic is affecting our food system. So first of all, I'm grateful for, I live in Philadelphia in the Northeast, and we are rapidly entering spring, and I'm grateful for all of the leaves that are starting to bud out on the trees, and there's a number of trees in the neighborhood already with lots of flowers. And in moments that sometimes feel heavy and dark, it's a great reminder of the cycles of the earth and renewal that happens this time of year. And a question that I've really been sitting with, and there's not really any answers for yet, is I'm just very curious to see what kind of better, more just, more equitable, more sustainable systems come out of this whole experience. I think it's giving a lot of people reason to pause and reflect and think about what's really most important, and also kind of explore a little bit more like how they actually meet their most basic needs, in particular food. And I think we might see some really interesting and innovative solutions that come out of this that are not just applicable for this moment when we're all kind of hunkering down, but potentially for the longer term as well. So I wanted to just kind of begin with a little bit of a framing of what does it mean to think about this moment from a Jewish perspective, and in particular how it relates to our food. So I have been someone who I've been studying kind of Jewish agricultural traditions for a very long time, and exploring what the implications are. I think Sam is trying to pull up a slide. So for those who might be less familiar, there's actually quite a robust Jewish agricultural tradition. 1/6 of the Mishnah, 1/6 of kind of Jewish law are all agricultural laws, the order of seeds. And I just wanted to share two examples that I think kind of help animate the underlying Jewish agricultural ethics and values. And that is this practice of peah, which is leaving the corners of our field. And it says in the Torah, when you go out to your field and you harvest, you don't harvest everything. You leave the corners of the fields and you leave the gleanings, the harvest that falls to the ground. You leave that for the poor, for the orphans, for the widows, for the strangers, for the people who are needy, for the people who are vulnerable, for the people who do not have their own land. In an agricultural economy, when the vast majority of people are farmers, if you don't have land, that puts you in a very vulnerable place in terms of food security. And our tradition teaches us that we have to design our actual farms in a way that we're leaving a chunk of that land for people who don't have their own land. And we're told the same thing about our grapes and our olive trees and our vineyards, our orchards, that we don't go back and collect kind of more than we need. We leave some of the surplus. We share the surplus for the stranger, for the orphan, and for the widow. And we do this because of our own experience in Egypt, that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, and that firsthand experience of suffering and oppression helps inform our whole tradition about how we relate to other people, in particular the most vulnerable. So if I had to summarize what the Jewish agricultural tradition teaches us, it's that we need to design food systems that put the needs of the most vulnerable members of our community at the center. And so this gives us an opportunity. Sam, you can turn off the screen share for a moment. This moment is a moment where our food system is being tested, is being pushed. There's more pressure on all the different aspects of the system. And when that happens, what tends to happen is the most vulnerable people in our community are the ones who suffer the most. So this is kind of a test of our ability to actually respond to those needs right now, not just in the immediate term, in the very short term, but also in the medium term and the long term. And we'll talk a little bit more about what some of those implications might be. So I also want to just kind of give a very basic overview of what we're talking about when we say our food system. So Sam, if you want to pull up that second slide. The food system, I don't know if you've ever done this exercise. If not, I recommend it. It's a powerful exercise. The next time you sit down to eat something, whether it's a meal that has a lot of different ingredients or even just an apple, before you take that first bite, try to retrace the steps that food took to get from where it started into your hands. And in our current global industrial food system, it's often very difficult to accurately trace the path that our food took. Most of our food travels thousands of miles across the country or across the world to get to us. And we can't really imagine what it looked like when it was growing and all the different people who played a part in getting it to us. So I wanted to kind of share this pretty basic diagram that just shows some of the different components of a food system. We're not just talking about the grocery store, but we have to go back all the way to food production, where the food is being grown on farms, then how that food gets aggregated, pulled together, and distributed through various channels. It might get processed into some sort of processed food. Marketing plays a huge role in creating the packaging and the advertising. Then it gets to markets and restaurants, and that's where consumers are getting access to it. And we're cooking it, consuming it, and then there's the disposal of any of the waste. All of those components are what makes up our food system. And so when we're thinking about some of the implications of this moment, we can't just think about well, how is this affecting me as a consumer or just the consumers? Or how is this affecting the grocery stores where I'm going and I'm seeing things and they look a little different than they used to? But we need to actually zoom out and think about the system as a whole. The other term that I wanted to define, and Sam, you can take this slide off. The other term that I wanted to define was two terms, food security and food justice. So these are terms that you might have heard before, and there's a lot of different definitions, but just for our purposes today, food security is the basic idea that you know where your next meal is coming from, that you have confidence that either it's in your pantry, it's in your kitchen already, or you can go to the store and buy what you need. And that you can meet your food needs not by relying on food charity or emergency food systems, that it's accessible and affordable. And some would say that it also needs to be culturally appropriate, that we're not just concerned about getting people calories, but we also recognize that people's relationship to food is very deep. And so true food security includes people having access to food that is culturally appropriate for them. And the term food justice, which I think of as kind of like an overarching umbrella term that looks at a whole range of social justice issues in our food system. But what is most important, I think, to understand about food justice is we're talking about structures and systems that are either helpful and sustainable and ethical, or they are oppressive and unjust. So for example, when you see someone asking for money and you give them a sandwich, that's not necessarily an act of food justice. That's an act of food charity. You're giving that person something to eat in the moment, but you're not changing any of the structures that have that person asking for money in the first place. So when we use the term food justice, we're looking at what are the systems that are in place that can help create or support a more just and equitable food system. Okay, that was a lot. We're going to kind of throw a lot of stuff at you, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A because we don't have a ton of time this evening. So I want to hand it over to Sam, who's going to just share a little bit about kind of what is the current state of our food system before all of this started a few weeks back.
Yeah, so similar to what Nati said, we can't cover all the different systems, all the different structures, all the pieces in place, but we're going to talk about the two, I would say, biggest players in this game of supporting folks who are food insecure, as Nati was saying before. So just quickly sharing this slide here. So it's going to have a couple of statistics on it, not everything I'm saying, but a couple of ideas. So first one, about 15% of the US lives in food insecurity in some way. That doesn't mean that you're always that, but over the course of a year, there is some point where you don't know where your next meal is coming from. The next piece I want to chat quickly about, there are 38 million people in the US using SNAP. SNAP is used to be called food stamps. It stands for now the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And to be eligible for that, just as a little bit of context, you need to have an income of less than 130% of the federal poverty line. So you have to be experiencing pretty extreme poverty to be applicable for it. And there's 38 million people. That's about 1 in every 9 people in the US. So we have, 13, 14 people on this call. So on average, about 1.5 of the people in this call would be on that program if you were to survey the whole US. SNAP, in its name, as I said, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, it's meant to be supplemental, but it's become more and more and more and more and more central to people's budgets when they're living in poverty, because we don't have many other systems to support them while they're experiencing poverty. On average, the monthly allocation is about $130 a person, which is not a lot of money to feed a person each month. And just also to note that the rates of people who are using SNAP benefits are much higher among people of color and the elderly, as those are populations that tend to have higher levels of poverty. And then the other system that I want to talk about is the emergency food system that consists of the network of soup kitchens and food pantries and food banks in the US. The emphasis I want to put on the word emergency, same as we had the emphasis on the word supplemental. The word emergency, the food is meant to be for people who have no other options. And as inequality in the US has grown, it's stretched to be able to supply people returning month after month and year after year. But it was already at its limits before the pandemic. The last quick stat that I want to share with you is, according to a survey from an organization called Hunger Free America that does really wonderful work, and this is just an example for New York City, but 34.4% of emergency food providers, that's soup kitchens and food pantries in New York City, were in 2019 forced to turn people away, reduce food distribution, or limit the hours of operation, due to not having enough resources, not enough money, not enough food, not enough staff to be able to do that. Those organizations also often rely on volunteers. So thinking about, that's what they were saying last year, and now all the more so. There's more people who are looking, and there are fewer volunteers who can help fill those slots, who can help support and add additional capacity, because people are rightfully looking to stay safe, not looking to spread any virus and all of that stuff. Do you want to do if there are any quick questions, Nati, before we move to the next section?
Yeah.
All right. Anybody got any questions on the stuff that Nati and I have been sharing so far? Feel free to unmute yourself or just type in the chat.
Okay, great. So, great. So thanks, Sam. And yeah, there's obviously tons of this kind of information online, and a lot of the best information that I found, the most clearest information when it comes to issues of food insecurity in this country, you can actually find on the websites of different anti-hunger organizations. They tend to have that stuff in the most kind of user-friendly format, has been my experience, if you're looking to kind of dive deeper into some of that stuff. So the question is, how does this pandemic and our response to it affect our food system? And so what I want to say first is that in a moment of crisis, the impact of this crisis is going to be felt very disproportionately across different demographics, largely based on class. And in this country, that also brings in kind of a racial element as well, as people of color are far more likely to be living in poverty or living with less access to resources. So while those who have access to more resources, this might kind of be a bummer. You have to stay home for who knows how long, but you're ordering the food that you need. You have your heat, you have your electricity, you have your internet, you have your water. All of those kinds of needs are being taken care of. You have the technology to access a lot of the new and emerging services that are coming online right now to respond to this moment. People who are living in poverty don't necessarily have those things. They might be hourly employees who they were laid off immediately when these shutdowns were first put in place, or even if they're told to stay home for 2 weeks and therefore not earn a paycheck, that actually sends them into kind of a spiral of more issues arising. They might not have if they don't have extra money, they might not be able to stock up on a bunch of food for a few weeks at a time, the way that probably a lot of us have, which then keeps us safer by minimizing the need to go back out shopping, etc. They might not have a car. They're relying on public transit, which might not be the best way to get around right now in this moment. Or they might not have internet at home or the technology to navigate some of these new systems. And as Sam mentioned, they might also already be relying on a number of different emergency food programs that are very volunteer driven. And when volunteers are no longer showing up to pack boxes or deliver food, then that puts a real challenge on them getting their food needs being met. I've been thinking about kind of like two different types of impacts. There's, in terms of immediate impacts, one is perceived and one is actual. I mean, I think it's been interesting for me to see how Americans are responding to this moment, and the urge to panic shop and stock up on huge amounts of food and other resources, when at least on the surface, there's not really any indication that there'll be any major disruptions to our food systems in the short term. And in fact, what's happening is the panic buying is causing some of those disruptions, because now that a lot of food is not available or less available, and then that causes more panic, which causes more people buying food. And again, what happens in those moments is then sometimes the people who are most vulnerable suffer the most from that. So there's also kind of like immediate, medium term, and longer term implications that I've been thinking about. And certainly the medium and longer term, we don't really know. We don't know how long this situation is going to play out. And we're still not sure what all the implications are going to be. In terms of the immediate, I mean, there's some of the obvious ones, right? Restaurants needing to close or transition to pickup and delivery exclusively, which is cutting into their revenue, which is causing restaurant employees to be laid off. So you have a lot of people who are losing their jobs in the food industry right now. People who are already low-wage workers, who probably didn't have a whole lot of security or financial security, have been laid off. Thankfully, some of the bills that have been passed are creating unemployment benefits for people who generally wouldn't be eligible, whose jobs don't usually come with unemployment benefits. You might have noticed, depending on where you live, food deliveries are becoming like the norm for groceries, for takeout, et cetera. So much so that a lot of those services are overbooked right now and are trying to respond as quickly as possible to meet the needs of the customer. There's actually, in this moment where we're like panicking about food shortages, there's actually a huge potential for food waste, because you have, let's say, wholesale food distributors who are sitting on thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of food, hundreds of thousands of dollars of food that was earmarked for restaurants. Now restaurants are closed. And so now they need to quickly find other people to buy that food. So I've seen in Philadelphia several wholesale food distributors that normally don't work with individuals are now selling boxes of produce or delivering, small family size deliveries, because they need to move this food and not let it go to waste. And as Sam mentioned, we're starting to see, shortages of volunteers in the emergency food system. In the medium term, we are already experiencing massive surge in unemployment. We've had a very low unemployment number for many years now. And then just this past week, 3.3 million people applied for unemployment benefits. That is a huge jump, and that's just initially. I have friends who have gotten laid off, who got laid off right away, with the expectation that they would apply for unemployment. I have other friends who their jobs are like, okay, we're going to keep you on board for now, but it could be that in 2 weeks we let you off, or in a month we let you off. And so that rise in unemployment is going to have a huge impact on the food system. Generally, I think if you it depends on your income, obviously, but if you're applying for unemployment, you probably will qualify for SNAP. So there's probably going to be a huge rise in applications for SNAP benefits as well. As far as I know, the money is there for those programs, but you're going to just start to see like way more people relying on that. And also, I'm seeing, new systems are starting to emerge even by the week. as people are trying to figure out how to get their groceries, and Instacart or, Fresh Direct or things like that are not reliable right now. So I'm seeing kind of people pooling together or doing wholesale orders and kind of changing the way that they source food. And I'm curious to see how many of those new systems might stick after this whole pandemic kind of dies down a bit. And then lastly, in terms of the longer term, I think there's the potential for some pretty serious long-term implications in our food system. In particular, right now, as I understand, our borders with Canada and Mexico are closed. A huge percentage of the people who work on farms in the U.S. are migrant farm workers. And so if they're not in the country right now, and we're not sure when the borders might open up again, that has the potential to lead to a huge shortage of labor on farms. So that's not affecting anything for the next few weeks in terms of when we go to the store. All of that food has already been kind of well on its way in our food system. But when we start thinking about, this growing season and food that's being planted now that would be harvested in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, and if there's not workers to do that kind of work, then there's some potential shortages that'll happen. What's interesting is this might just completely change our food system because you also have a huge surge in unemployed people. So, well, if there's work to be done on farms and there's a lot of unemployed people, like that, we might change who works on farms, which, could also cause food prices to go up because generally migrant farm labor is not paid all that well. And if they're replaced with Americans, then they will probably get paid more. I think the most important thing to note is, in terms of long-term consequences, is around the economy and economic challenges. The single driver of hunger in the United States is poverty. And so if you are living in poverty, you are far more likely to experience hunger. It makes sense both in terms of, not having as much money to spend on food, but also if you're living in poverty, you're more likely living in areas where food is harder to access, where ironically the food that is accessible is more expensive. And so you get all of these kind of challenges get compounded on top of each other. And I think that is going to be one of the big long-term impacts to keep an eye on, and how we respond. This initial couple of stimulus packages might have some effect in the short or medium term, but it's unclear kind of in the long term if they're going to be able to avoid a huge rise in unemployment and therefore rise in poverty in this country. The last thing I want to say here, and then we're going to, I think, kind of transition into some Q&A with maybe some prompts for folks in the chat. But I just want to say that I'm also seeing some really interesting positive changes happen to our food system, even in the short term. Like I mentioned, people coming together in communities and figuring out ways to collectively buy food and support local farmers and local food producers, while also meeting their needs in a way that is safe. Those are things that I think have some staying power. Even like our food co-op in West Philly that we go to has now just completely changed their schedule, where they are having an hour every morning for people who are older or vulnerable to go. They're limiting the number of people who can be in the store at any time. They're doing a better job of sanitizing. And now they just started kind of curbside pickup. And it's inspiring to see like people who work at a grocery store all of a sudden being like held up as heroes in this moment. But they really are adapting and trying to take care of the needs of the folks in the community, again, with an eye towards the folks who are most vulnerable. So yeah, we wanted to share a couple of prompts that if folks wanted to add to the chat, that would be great. And then we can kind of open it up to some bigger questions and answers as well before we close.
We're kind of running out of time. But if anyone has anything that they want to add, exactly what Sam said in the chat right now, if you have any questions, go ahead for it. Just try and make sure they're concise or actually out of time, but it doesn't really matter.
And while folks are thinking of questions, we have a couple of questions from the beginning from the chat that maybe we can respond to as people are formulating more. So one question around how is all of this buying and stopping up food will affect the food supply long term? I think Nati spoke about that a little bit. Do you have anything to add to that, Nati? What you said before?
Yeah. I don't, from what I understand, the assuming people kind of did their initial surge of panic buying and now it'll kind of level out. I don't think that is going to have any long-term impacts on the food system. You know, we live in a weird country where about half of the food that's produced gets thrown out. So there's quite a bit of surplus right now in the system. That I think it can handle that. If people continue to shop like that, then I think we might see more of an impact, especially if we end up with kind of a labor shortage and then we're not able to produce as much. But so far, I don't think that is a particular issue. There's also a question of if there's any certain types of food that are having shortages. Again, not in the long term. I don't think that right now, at least, we're looking at specific foods. I think in the panic buying, you know, kind of milk, eggs, bread seem to be things that were hard to get, at least personally, in the last couple of weeks.
Flour, I've heard. Yeast.
Yeah, flour and yeast. I mean, it's interesting. Like all of a sudden, you get all these people who are baking bread, right? Who never baked bread before. People who are cooking way more than they normally do. And so there is something oddly kind of poetic or inspiring about this moment that's kind of forcing people into their homes and to take things slower and to like get more engaged with their food. And I think that good stuff can come out of that.
I would love to, Donna, is that how you pronounce her name? Donna?
Yes, that's right.
Share a little bit about what's going on in Argentina.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Dana. I'm from Buenos Aires. I would like to share a little bit about the situation here because it's similar in some ways. And it's not quite similar in some others. 1/3 of our population is poor. So it's very hard to a lot of people here to reach to the basic stuff, to most of the basic stuff like health insurance or food or a roof to live in. So what happened when all the quarantine thing started is that kids that go to some schools that will provide the basic supplies for them, like the 3 meals of the day, they wouldn't have their food because they would eat at school, because at home they wouldn't have enough, like their parents couldn't buy the food for them. So in a lot of schools here, the kids would eat there. And what happened is that schools needed to still be open for the kids to be able to feed themselves. It might be a little weird for you to hear because like all the kids would eat at their homes, but here for a lot of families, it's very hard. So yeah, some schools are still open for them just to go and eat, and they would go back home if they have a home. So we have some shelters, but it's still very hard. So yeah, I wanted to share that.
Yeah,
yeah.
I was going to say that's happening in America as well. I mean, especially in cities a lot of people, a lot of kids, the only good meal that they get every day is at school. And so in Philadelphia, the mayor was a bit reluctant to close the schools because for some kids, that's the safe place where they can go and that's where they can get food. And so the city has responded and has created alternate places for kids to go to just to get the food. But yes, it was actually the same issue here.
That's interesting. I didn't know that, but I just wanted to share because I feel like it's a very, very hard situation. But yeah, I hope it gets better soon for all of us in the whole world.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Donna. There are some notes in the chat that I want to highlight and maybe give a quick response to before we close. So Sasha wrote, any suggestions for ways to help other than donating funds? Of course, donating is really, really important if you have the ability to do so. And I know that that's what's happening later in the closing of JServe is some awesome teen philanthropy. Continuing, our local food bank, the largest in the country, is still open to volunteers, yet going there is at odds with the best practices around gathering in groups. And many people would like to help, but don't know how. So Meredith put something in the chat, a suggestion of what had been volunteering with the Food Recovery Network, but that's not happening. It's not available now. But I think one of the things that I'm seeing that's very, very important are how we're creating local networks to support each other, mutual aid groups and things like that. So how can you work with your block or religious group that you're a part of, like, I don't know, a synagogue, a JCC, youth group, that kind of thing that you're a part of, or some other group that you're a part of, to check in regularly with people, see what kinds of needs they have, see how you can support them on a one-to-one, but growing into much larger because we're doing it on the level of blocks or neighborhoods. And then you can try to follow the best practices and the guidelines that are coming from the government or from your government, from whichever government you're part of, you're under, to deliver the food and maybe call the person, let them know that it's at their door, but that you're not right next to them as they're looking to pick it up. Especially helpful and important for at-risk populations, like we talked about the elderly. I'm sure you've heard folks who have any sort of respiratory illness or chronic disease, anything like that, making sure that they are safe and protected, and anyone who might have, who thinks that they might be sick is also isolating themselves. But others, there are ways to get involved, like what I was saying, but making sure you're doing so really, really carefully and thoughtfully, and washing your hands and sanitizing and all that stuff that you need to do.
Yeah, and you know, in Philadelphia right now, the exception to the rule of staying home is people who work for essential businesses, and food is obviously one of them. So even though that might not be you, you're not a professional, volunteers who help meet the food needs of people, especially vulnerable people, that's also considered essential. So, you know, there are safety precautions you can take to be involved. But I think if you're healthy, if you're not in the vulnerable population, and you're in a position to donate some time, you know, I think you can look to do so. And I agree with Sam, like really starting on a very local level, with just like the local food pantry, the local soup kitchen, the local hunger relief organization. Give them a call and see what they need. And it could even be, there might be ways that they can benefit from work that you can do at your computer. You know, maybe it's some kind of file processing or marketing, getting the word out about things if you don't feel comfortable going. But I do think that is an important thing. I was reading a story about a high school student who created like a grocery delivery service for older folks in her community. And that's what she's been doing with her time since her school closed. So there are ways to do that, and to do so in you know, keeping the safety precautions in mind. And that's definitely something that can benefit things in the short term. So we wanted to just close with a couple of, you know, I know a lot of the news is very heavy, and that can feel very overwhelming. And I think that in moments like this, it's really important to keep hope, keep cultivating hope. And for me, reading some of the stories of the ways people are stepping up and helping each other has been really inspiring. And again, has had me thinking about, what are the positives that could eventually emerge from this moment. So I just wanted to highlight a couple. A friend of mine who's a farmer in just outside of Philly in South Jersey, he immediately put out a call to using some of the language of during World War II. I don't know if you know this, but there was a movement called the Victory Garden movement, which was basically like get everyone to plant gardens on their lawns. And they say at some point, at its peak, 40%, I mean, that's a huge percentage, of 40% of the produce that was consumed by Americans was grown in their home gardens. So my friend Nate Kleiman decided to kind of use that language and launched something that he's calling the Cooperative Gardens Commission, basically saying that there are, we might be facing some food shortages in a few months. The more people growing food right now, the better. If you want to grow food and don't know where to start, fill out this form. If you know stuff about growing food and you want to help people, fill out this form. And he has created a very rapidly growing network of growers and supporters to help get more people planting gardens right now in the Northeast. This is the perfect time to be doing that. There's restaurants that are transforming themselves into emergency soup kitchens and preparers of food to be delivered to vulnerable people. People who work in the food industry are already very well trained in food safety and hygiene, and they are some of the best people to be putting into some of these roles right now. So that's happening up and down. And then one example from right across the street from my house, there's a group called Food Not Bombs that generally they operate where once a week they get a ton of food donations over the course of the week. And once a week they set up in a park and they just give out food to whoever comes. And they have completely switched to delivering food directly to the doors of people who are hungry. And one of their challenges has been a lot of these folks are not online, are not seeing their Facebook posts, are not connected. And so they've had to really go about and knock on doors and get people's contact info and just kind of go in a slightly more old-fashioned way to engage the older folks and the most vulnerable folks and really meet their needs. And what they're doing in the process is as Sam mentioned, they're strengthening the ties that make for a very strong community. And so I just think that is that these are some of the important efforts to highlight. And so we're not only thinking about the things that are weighing on us, but also the things that are bringing us hope in this moment.
Thanks for closing that way with us, Nati. I hope it gave some inspiration, some ideas for folks who are looking for ways to get involved and to get activated at this time when we really need everyone's hands who are able to.
Great.
And I just popped a link to my email address in the chat. If you want to ask more questions, if you have more thoughts, want to have a follow-up conversation, feel free to send me an email.
Yeah, so thank you guys for all coming to this JSERF session. We really love the different perspectives that we had, even from Argentina, which is super cool, and we're really happy about that. And just like Sam said, he put his email in the chat. If you guys have any questions, just let them know. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer. And yeah, everyone, just hope you guys stay safe.
All right. Good night, everyone. Stay safe.
Good night.
Thanks so much, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.